September 1854. The hills above Sevastopol. British soldiers looked down at the massive fortress sprawling below them. Russia's great naval base on the Black Sea. Stone walls, defensive bastions, over 100 heavy guns. And somewhere behind these fortifications, tens of thousands of Russian troops preparing to defend their city to the death. The plan had seemed simple back in England. Land in Crimea, march to Sevastopol, capture it quickly, go home before winter. It was September now. The fortress looked impregnable. Winter was approaching, and British commanders faced a terrible choice. Attack immediately with inadequate preparation, or wait and risk everything when the Crimean winter arrived. They had 60,000 Allied troops. They'd just won a victory at the Alma River. Russian forces were retreating. This was the moment to strike. But the fortress below them looked stronger every day as Russian engineers worked frantically to improve defences. And nobody knew what winter in Crimea would bring. Would British soldiers even survive campaigning in conditions they'd never experienced? Could the army maintain a siege through snow and cold, with supply lines stretched across the Black Sea? This is the story of Sevastopol, the siege where British forces had to decide whether professional soldiers could outlast Russia's most important fortress. The campaign where every passing week raised the stakes higher. And the question that haunted British commanders from the first day: could they take Sevastopol before Sevastopol destroyed them? Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're covering the Crimean War's defining campaign, the siege that tested British endurance to its absolute limit and changed how Britain fought wars forever. Because Sevastopol wasn't won through brilliant tactics or heroic charges. It was won through stubborn determination to keep fighting when every sensible consideration said to quit. But before we get to those frozen trenches and disease-ravaged camps, before we watch British soldiers die by the thousands from cholera and exposure, we need to understand why Britain was in Crimea at all. Because without understanding the larger war, you can't appreciate what made Sevastopol so important, or why British troops refused to give up despite 11 months of hell. And if you're interested in the campaigns that tested British resolve to its breaking point, make sure you're subscribed. We're covering the battles that matter, the long, hard fights that don't make good paintings, but reveal what British soldiers could endure. Let's go back to 1853, when the Crimean War began over questions nobody today can entirely explain. Officially, it was about religious rights in Jerusalem, whether Catholic or Orthodox monks controlled Christian holy sites. Really, it was about Russian expansion into Ottoman territory and Britain's determination to stop it. Russia wanted access to the Mediterranean through the Turkish Straits. Britain wanted Russia contained in the Black Sea. France wanted military glory to restore Napoleonic prestige. And the Ottoman Empire just wanted to survive Russian aggression. When Russia invaded Ottoman territories in 1853, Britain and France declared war. The conflict needed a decisive action, something that would force Russia to negotiate. The answer was obvious: capture Sevastopol, destroy Russia's Black Sea fleet, cripple Russian naval power permanently. It was the kind of bold, strategic strike Victorian Britain loved. Ambitious, dramatic, and catastrophically underestimating the task. In September 1854, British, French, and Ottoman forces landed at Eupatoria in Crimea, 60,000 Allied troops intent on capturing Sevastopol 35 miles away. They expected limited resistance, a quick march, perhaps one battle, then Sevastopol would fall and the war would end before winter. On September 20th, the Allied army fought its first battle at the Alma River. Russian forces under Prince Menshikov attempted to block the advance. British and French troops attacked uphill against Russian positions and won decisively. Russian casualties were heavy. Menshikov's army retreated towards Sevastopol in disorder. The path to the city seemed open. Allied commanders celebrated. Surely Sevastopol would surrender when faced with 60,000 victorious troops. But Menshikov didn't surrender. He withdrew his field army from Sevastopol, but left strong forces to defend the fortress. Russian engineers led by Colonel Eduard Totleben immediately began strengthening the city's defences. Guns were positioned, trenches dug, bastions reinforced, and the Russian garrison, sailors from the Black Sea Fleet plus infantry regiments, prepared to defend every inch of ground. The Allied commanders made their first critical error. Instead of attacking immediately while Russian defences were still incomplete, they spent weeks establishing supply bases and siege positions. The British set up at Balaclava, a small port south of Sevastopol. The French established themselves at Kamish Bay. Siege artillery was landed, trenches were dug, and while the Allies prepared methodically, Russian defenders strengthened fortifications that would prove nearly impossible to breach. By October 17th, when the first Allied bombardment began, Sevastopol had transformed from vulnerable city into formidable fortress. Russian defensive lines stretched 7 kilometres. 8 major bastions mounted over 100 heavy guns. Trenches connected defensive positions, and Russian engineers had created interlocking fields of fire that made direct assault suicidal. The October bombardment was supposed to destroy Russian defences and allow a quick assault. British and French artillery fired thousands of rounds into the city. Russian guns fired back with devastating accuracy. After 2 days, it was clear the bombardment had accomplished nothing. Russian defences were too strong. Russian gunners were too skilled, and the Allies lacked the heavy siege artillery necessary to breach stone fortifications. Worse, Prince Menshikoff's field army, still intact outside Sevastopol, began attacking Allied positions from the rear. On October 25th, Russian forces attacked British positions at Balaclava in an attempt to cut Allied supply lines. The battle was chaotic and confused. The famous charge of the Light Brigade, a suicidal cavalry charge into Russian artillery, became the engagement's most remembered moment. Though it accomplished nothing strategically, British forces held Balaclava but barely. On November 5th, Menshikov tried again at Inkerman. Russian forces attacked British positions in thick fog, attempting to overwhelm the besiegers through sheer numbers. British soldiers fought blind in what became known as the Soldiers' Battle. Small unit actions where sergeants and corporals led desperate defences because officers couldn't see to give orders. British forces held, but casualties were severe, and then winter arrived. The Crimean Winter of 1854 to 1855 became legendary for its brutality. British forces, having expected a quick campaign, had no winter clothing, no proper tents, no adequate supplies. Ships carrying winter equipment were lost in storms, supply systems collapsed, and British soldiers in trenches outside Sevastopol began dying from exposure, frostbite, and disease at horrific rates. The real killer wasn't Russian bullets, it was cholera. The disease spread through British camps like wildfire. Men would be healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. Entire regiments were decimated. Field hospitals overflowed. And because British logistics were so catastrophically mismanaged, there weren't enough doctors, medicine, or supplies to treat the sick. Cholera wasn't the only killer. Dysentery ravaged British camps. Frostbite claimed hundreds of limbs. Scurvy weakened men who couldn't get fresh food. Pneumonia killed soldiers whose weakened bodies couldn't fight infection. And simple exposure, spending night after night in freezing trenches, wearing inadequate clothing, killed more British soldiers than Russian artillery ever would. The statistics were damning. By January 1855, British effective strength had collapsed from over 30,000 men to barely 12,000 fit for duty. Disease had destroyed 2/3 of British combat power without the Russians firing a shot. Hospital ships sailed back to Britain, filled with sick and dying men. Reinforcements arrived and immediately fell ill. The entire British army in Crimea was slowly disintegrating. British officers watched their regiments melt away and could do nothing. They wrote desperate letters home describing the catastrophe. They pleaded for winter clothing, proper food, medicine, anything. But the supply system was so fundamentally broken that even when supplies existed, they couldn't reach the troops. Ships sat in Balaclava harbour, filled with winter coats while soldiers froze in summer uniforms. Food rotted on docks while troops starved. The disconnect between what existed and what reached soldiers was criminal. Individual British soldiers showed extraordinary resilience. They improvised solutions when official systems failed. They shared what little they had. They cared for sick comrades when no doctors were available. They maintained discipline and morale when every logical reason suggested they should break. The ordinary British soldier at Sevastopol demonstrated a level of endurance that officers in London could barely comprehend. Florence Nightingale became famous for her work at Scutari Hospital across the Black Sea, where British wounded and sick were sent. Her reforms improved conditions dramatically, but for soldiers in the trenches outside Sevastopol, there was little help. They lived in mud, ate inadequate rations, froze in thin summer uniforms, and died by the hundreds from diseases that proper supplies and organisation could have prevented. The siege itself became a grinding stalemate. British and French troops dug elaborate trench networks approaching Russian defences. Russian troops dug counter-trenches and rifle pits. Both sides conducted constant sniping. Artillery exchanged fire daily. Small-scale raids and counter-raids fought over yards of ground. It was trench warfare in its purest form, the same kind of fighting that would dominate World War I 60 years later. British soldiers discovered that modern warfare against fortified positions was nothing like Waterloo. There were no grand cavalry charges, no massed infantry formations, just grinding attrition in trenches, where survival depended on keeping your head down and praying Russian sharpshooters missed. Officers who'd learned their profession in the Napoleonic Wars found themselves commanding a type of warfare they'd never imagined. Daily life in the trenches was a nightmare of boredom, punctuated by terror. Soldiers stood watch in mud-filled trenches, exposed to Russian snipers who'd learned to shoot with devastating accuracy. Russian marksmen operated from rifle pits, small fortified positions in no man's land, and picked off any British soldier careless enough to show himself. British troops learned quickly that survival meant staying low, moving carefully, and never underestimating Russian shooting skills. The trenches themselves were engineering marvels and death traps simultaneously. British sappers dug approach trenches, zigzagging lines that slowly crept towards Russian positions. The work was done at night under constant Russian artillery fire. Engineers would advance the trench forward a few yards, then retreat before dawn. Progress was measured in feet per night, and every yard gained cost casualties as Russian gunners fired into the darkness at the sounds of digging. Artillery exchanges were constant and devastating. British siege guns fired thousands of rounds daily at Russian positions. Russian artillery fired back with equal intensity. The landscape between the lines became a cratered moonscape where nothing could survive. Trees were shattered to stumps. Buildings collapsed into rubble, and the ground was churned into mud mixed with shell fragments and worse. But the artillery duels, horrific as they were, weren't the worst part. The worst part was the waiting. Hours in trenches with nothing to do except watch for Russian attacks and try to stay warm. Men would huddle in dugouts, sharing what warmth they could, talking about home, wondering if they'd ever see England again. Some wrote letters knowing they might be dead before the letters reached home. Others simply endured in silence, conserving energy for when fighting began. British newspapers began reporting the terrible conditions. Correspondents sent back accounts of British soldiers dying from cholera, freezing in inadequate clothing, starving because supply systems failed. The British public was outraged. How could the army that won Waterloo be reduced to such a state? Parliament demanded answers. The Aberdeen government fell over the mismanagement. And slowly, grudgingly, the British military establishment began implementing reforms. New supply systems were created. A railway was built from Balaclava to the siege lines, the Grand Crimean Central Railway that delivered food, ammunition, and supplies to troops. Winter clothing finally arrived. Medical services improved. By spring 1855, British forces were adequately supplied, and conditions improved significantly. But the damage was done. Thousands of British soldiers had died unnecessarily because Victorian military administration proved catastrophically inadequate. Meanwhile, the siege ground on. Both sides conducted major operations to break the stalemate. In May 1855, British and French forces launched attacks on Russian positions, covering key approaches to Sevastopol. The fighting was savage. Hand-to-hand combat in trenches, artillery duels at point-blank range, infantry charges against prepared defences. The Allies gained some ground, but at horrific cost. In June, another major assault attempted to capture the Malakoff Redoubt and the Redan, key Russian strongpoints. French forces attacked the Malakoff, British forces targeted the Redan. The attacks were supposed to be coordinated, but British timing was off. French troops reached the Malakoff and fought desperately, but were driven back with heavy casualties. British assault on the Redan was repulsed with similar losses. The failed attacks cost thousands of casualties and accomplished nothing. Lord Raglan, the British commander, died shortly after from cholera, though many said the failed assault broke his spirit as much as disease killed him. Command passed to General Simpson, who inherited a siege that seemed unwinnable. Russian defences were too strong. Russian determination was too fierce, and every Allied attack was thrown back with terrible casualties. In August 1855, Russian forces made their own attempt to break the siege at the Battle of the Chernaya River. Russian troops attacked French and Sardinian positions, attempting to break the Allied lines. The assault failed catastrophically. Russian casualties were heavy, and the defeat convinced Russian commanders that they couldn't break the siege from outside. The final push came in September 1855. Allied artillery conducted a massive bombardment, 20 days of continuous shelling that fired over 150,000 shells into Russian positions. The bombardment was meant to destroy Russian defences completely before the final assault. Russian fortifications were battered, buildings collapsed, fires raged, but Russian soldiers kept fighting, repairing defences at night that had been destroyed during the day. On September 8th, French forces launched a determined assault on the Malakoff redoubt. This time, instead of a frontal attack, French troops had dug approach trenches that reached within yards of the Malakoff. When the assault began, French soldiers crossed open ground quickly and stormed into the Malakoff before Russian defenders could respond effectively. Savage fighting erupted, but French troops held the position despite desperate Russian counterattacks. The fighting inside the Malakoff was brutal hand-to-hand combat. French infantry cleared Russian positions room by room, trench by trench. Russian defenders counterattacked repeatedly, trying to drive the French out. Artillery from both sides fired into the contested position, killing friend and foe alike. But French soldiers held. They fortified captured positions. They repulsed every counterattack. And by day's end, the Malakoff, key to Sevastopol's defences, was firmly in French hands. British forces simultaneously attacked the Redan. The assault was supposed to coordinate with the French success at the Malakoff, but British troops faced impossible conditions. Rocky ground prevented adequate trench approaches, and Russian fire devastated the attacking columns. British soldiers fought bravely, reaching the Redan's walls and attempting to storm the fortification. Some men made it into Russian positions. Officers led from the front, falling wounded or killed. But without the close approach trenches the French enjoyed, British troops were exposed to devastating defensive fire across hundreds of yards of open ground. The Redan's defenders, Russian sailors and infantry, fought with desperate courage. They knew the Malakoff's fall meant Sevastopol's doom, and they defended the Redan as if defending it could somehow change reality. They fired organised volleys into British attackers. They threw back every attempt to establish positions inside the Redan. And when British troops finally withdrew, Russian defenders had held, but at terrible cost. British casualties in the Redan assault were over 2,500 killed and wounded. The failed attack was Britain's bloodiest single day of the siege. Officers who survived described the horror of leading men across open ground into point-blank Russian fire, watching soldiers cut down in swathes, reaching the Redan, only to find Russian defenders too numerous and too determined to overcome. The attack failed not from British cowardice. The troops fought magnificently, but because the tactical situation was simply impossible. However, the French capture of the Malakoff was decisive. The Malakoff's position dominated Sevastopol's defences. With French artillery now positioned there, Russian positions throughout the city became untenable. Russian commanders recognised the situation immediately. Sevastopol could no longer be held. On September 11th, Russian forces executed their evacuation plan. They sank their remaining ships in Sevastopol's harbour to prevent capture. They destroyed fortifications that had cost so much blood to defend. They set fires throughout the city, and they withdrew across the bay to the north side. Allied forces entered a ruined, burning city the next morning. After 11 months, Sevastopol had fallen. British casualties during the siege were approximately 20,000 dead, but only a fraction died from combat. Most died from disease, exposure, and catastrophic logistics failures. French casualties were similar. Russian losses exceeded 100,000 killed and wounded, defending Sevastopol. For Britain, Sevastopol represented both triumph and trauma. British soldiers had demonstrated extraordinary endurance, living in trenches through 2 brutal winters, fighting while dying from disease, maintaining discipline when supply systems collapsed. But the campaign also exposed catastrophic failures in British military organisation that cost thousands of preventable deaths. The siege led directly to major reforms. Supply systems were modernised. Medical services were professionalised following Nightingale's example. The British army that emerged from Crimea was fundamentally different. More professional, better organised, determined never again to let soldiers die from preventable causes. Strategically, Sevastopol achieved its goal. Russia's Black Sea Fleet was destroyed. The Treaty of Paris in 1856 forbade Russia from maintaining warships in the Black Sea, a restriction lasting 20 years. Britain had contained Russian expansion at tremendous cost. The siege also changed how Britain thought about warfare. The romantic notions of cavalry charges that dominated thinking after Waterloo died in Sevastopol's trenches. Modern warfare meant artillery, trenches, and grinding attrition. It meant logistics mattered as much as courage. Sevastopol entered British military tradition as the campaign where soldiers proved what they could endure. It wasn't a battle to celebrate in paintings. It was a siege to remember as proof that British troops could survive conditions that should have broken them and still complete their mission. If this is the kind of military history that matters to you, the campaigns that tested British endurance to its absolute limit, the sieges won through stubborn determination rather than brilliant tactics, the moments when British soldiers proved they could outlast any adversary through sheer bloody-minded refusal to quit, then you know what to do. These stories deserve to be told. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The campaigns that mattered, told the way they deserve to be told.